If you want to find out who Melchizedek really was, you have to follow the footsteps of Abraham first. I'll go slow because there's a lot of detail in this story, but it starts in Genesis chapter 14. Abraham had just won an unwinnable war to save his nephew Lot, and in the process, he rescued several cities that had been taken captive along with him. When the king of one of those cities, the infamous city of Sodom, offered him wealth as a reward, he turned it down flat, refusing to let anyone claim to have made him rich apart from God. But before he ever got to that refusal, something else happened. A king priest named Melchizedek walked down from a city on a hill and offered him something entirely different. He didn't offer him wealth or the spoils of war, but he offered a sacred meal of bread and wine. And Abram, the man who had just said no to the vast wealth of Sodom, gave this priest 10% of everything he had taken in that battle. This is a real thing that happened in a real place with real people. There is a mystery of who Melchizedek really was, his true identity, and it's been debated for millennia, from David to the Dead Sea Scrolls to the book of Hebrews, and that debate's not going to end today, which is why I'm more interested in finding the man himself. That's what we're going to study. To understand what happened in that valley and why it's so historically significant, you have to understand the world Abraham lived in. You have to see Canaan for what it really was 2,000 years ago. Before we dive in, since you're watching this channel, you probably already know that I've been working on a book for a while now. It's called Dynasty of Slaves, and it's the most comprehensive thing I've ever written. It's on the history of Israel and Egypt. It's the archaeology, the timeline, the people, and the evidence that puts the biblical story in real time and real place, which is exactly what we're doing today with Melchizedek. If you want to be the first to know when it's ready, and I promise you it's going to be ready very soon, join my email newsletter at the link in the description. Print formatting is done. Ebook formatting is done. And I'm going to be recording the audiobook over the next coming week or so. Make sure that you're on the email list to get it when it goes live. All right, now back to the story. In Canaan, in the 19th century BC, Canaan was not a nation. It was a mosaic of independent city-states, each one perched on a defensible hill or controlling a critical water source, negotiating its own survival in a landscape where the major powers of the ancient world were constantly pressing in from every direction. What held the region together loosely and always temporarily was power. Whoever had it extracted tribute from whoever didn't have it, and the arrangement held until someone decided it no longer had to. That's the world the 5 cities of the Jordan Plain were living in when they stopped paying tribute to a powerful king from the east. For 12 years they had paid, and payment meant more than just goods and silver. It was a public declaration of submission, an acknowledgement that you depended on a stronger king for your survival. In the 13th year, they stopped paying. In the 14th year, that king came to collect, and by the time he was finished, the cities of the plain were plundered, their people chained, and among those captives was a man named Lot, Abraham's nephew. One man escaped and ran to tell Abraham, and what happened next is one of the most understated military moments in the entire Bible. Abraham wasn't a wandering shepherd like we often see him. He was a wealthy patriarch, and he had 318 trained fighting men born in his own household. And he rode north, struck the coalition by night, and didn't stop until every captive was recovered and every possession returned. He was walking home from that battle when 2 kings rode out to meet him, and the contrast between those 2 meetings is the whole point of Genesis 14. One of those people was the king of Sodom. The other was Melchizedek, king of Salem. So, who was Melchizedek, and where did he come from? Genesis 14:18 says he was the king of Salem and priest of Elyon, God Most High. That's almost everything the text gives us about his identity. And for a long time, that was all anyone had to work with. But in the last 2 centuries, archaeology has been quietly filling in the world around that single verse. And what it has found is pretty remarkable. Start with the city, Salem. The root of that name is the same root that runs through the Hebrew word shalom, meaning peace or wholeness. And that root doesn't disappear after Genesis 14. Egyptian records from roughly the same century refer to a city in this region as Ru-Salimum. Then centuries later, the Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence between Canaan's city-state kings and the Pharaoh of Egypt, use the name Jerusalem for the same place. That same Salem root runs continuously through all of them, across millennia, pointing to the same hill until it becomes the same name every person watching this video already knows, Jerusalem. Melchizedek was king of one of the most consequential cities in history. And Egypt knew it. Among the most fascinating discoveries in ancient Near Eastern archaeology are what scholars call the execration texts, an Egyptian ritual practice of writing the names of enemies and hostile cities on pottery or figurines and smashing them as a ritual curse. These texts, dating to roughly the 19th century BC, include a city named Ru-Salimum, among those that Egypt considered threatening enough to curse. Think about what that means for a second. At roughly the same time that Abraham was walking through Canaan, Egypt was already watching this city on a hill carefully, watching it carefully enough to put it on a curse list even. Melchizedek was ruling a city that registered as a threat to one of the most powerful empires in the ancient world. And while we call it Salem, the Egyptians called it Ru-Salimum. In fact, based on the timing of the events in Genesis 14 and the dating of the execration texts found in Egypt, it's likely that the contemporary name of Melchizedek's city was Ru-Salimum, not simply Salem. Ru-Salimum means foundation of peace, not simply just peace. Now come closer into this story. Come to the eastern slope of the city of David in Jerusalem, just above the Gihon Spring, the perennial water source that is the reason Jerusalem exists where it does. In the ancient world, water was not a convenience. It was pure survival. A city without a reliable water source was not a city at all. It was a temporary arrangement waiting to fail. The Gihon Spring ran year-round, cold and consistent, carving its way out of the limestone bedrock on the eastern slope of the hill. And every settlement that ever stood on that ridge stood there because of that spring. It was the reason Melchizedek's city was where it was. It was the reason David wanted it. It's the reason you can still walk down into the tunnel Hezekiah cut through the solid rock to protect that water source during the Assyrian siege, a tunnel that still carries water today. In 2010, Israeli archaeologist Eli Shukron excavated a series of chambers carved directly into the bedrock of that slope, just above the spring. And what he found connected the rocks and the dirt to Genesis chapter 14. Picture this space. These aren't grand temple halls like you might picture in a monolithic society. These are modest rock-cut rooms carved into the living stone of a hillside, the kind of space that feels intentional precisely because of its simplicity. In the ancient Near East, sacred space didn't have to be large to be significant. What made a place holy was not its size, but what happened inside of it. And what happened inside these chambers left physical evidence that archaeologists have been carefully piecing together ever since. The first thing that Shukron found was a raised rectangular platform with a drainage channel carved into the floor leading away from it. In the ancient world, across virtually every culture from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Canaan, that combination meant one thing: animal sacrifice. The platform holds the altar, and the channel carries the blood away. This isn't a controversial interpretation either. It's standard reading of that kind of architectural feature at a sacred site across the region. And it appears in Canaanite worship, in early Israelite worship, and eventually in the temple Solomon built on the hill above. The forms were ancient and widely shared among different cultures and religions. The question was always who the blood was being offered to. The second feature was an olive press. This requires a moment to appreciate, because an olive press in a sacred context in the ancient Near East was not primarily about food. It was about oil, anointing oil specifically. The production of consecrated oil for ritual use was a priestly function across the ancient Near East, from the courts of Egypt to the temples of Ugarit to the tabernacle Moses built in the wilderness. When a king was crowned, oil was poured. When a priest was consecrated, oil was poured. When a sacred object was set apart for divine use, they covered it in oil. The olive press in these chambers was not a kitchen installation. It wasn't a food production. It was a production facility for one of the most theologically loaded substances in the ancient world. And the third feature was a standing stone, a maseba, roughly 8 inches high, set into a small platform. And this is where the conversation gets interesting, because standing stones make a lot of modern Christians uncomfortable when they encounter them in biblical archaeology. They associate them automatically with paganism, maybe with Baal worship, with everything the prophets condemned later on. But the biblical text is more complicated than that. Jacob himself erected a standing stone at Bethel after his vision of the heavenly ladder, or staircase, and called it the house of God. He erected another one at Rachel's grave. He set one up as a witness pillar at his covenant with Laban. Standing stones in the early biblical tradition were not inherently pagan. They were markers of a sacred encounter, physical anchors for moments when heaven touched to earth, and they appear in legitimate Yahwistic worship throughout the patriarchal period. What the prophets condemned was not the standing stone itself, but the standing stone erected to Baal, or Asherah, to the gods who were not El Elyon. The form was ancient and shared. The problem was always the object of the worship, not the object itself. This is the broader point that I want you to see, because it reframes how we should think about Melchizedek's priesthood in the chambers above the Gihon Spring. The religious world of the 19th century BC didn't divide neatly into pagan and holy. It was a world with a shared vocabulary of sacred space, of sacred practice, altars and oil, standing stones, sacred meals, high places near water sources, and that vocabulary was used by everyone, from the priests of Baal to the priests of El to the patriarchs of Israel. What distinguished one tradition from another was not the form of the worship, but its direction, who it was being offered to, whose name did you speak over the oil, who did you acknowledge when you raised the cup. Now here's what makes that distinction between El and Baal so significant in this context. In the Canaanite pantheon, these were not interchangeable figures. El was the ancient patriarch of the gods, the creator, the one who presided over the divine council, the Most High. Baal was the storm god, the younger warrior deity who eventually challenged El's authority in the Ugaritic myths. When the biblical text uses El titles, like El Elyon or El Shaddai or El Elam, it is not borrowing from Baalism. It's drawing on the same ancient tradition that recognized a creator god above all other gods, a most high who held authority over the entire divine assembly. That's the tradition Melchizedek was working on, not the Baal tradition, the El tradition. And Abraham recognized it immediately because it was his tradition too. Because the chambers are carved into bedrock, there's no floor layer to give us a precise construction date, and the archaeologists have been honest about that limitation. What the pottery in an adjacent room tells us is that the site was in use in the 19th to 17th centuries BC, and that entire complex was deliberately sealed sometime in the 8th century BC, close to the period of the Northern Kingdom's exile, suggesting it was functioning as a sacred site for well over 1,000 years before someone put it out of use. That forward connection matters. It passes through the king's period. The drainage channel in that altar platform points toward the 40 years David housed the Ark of the Covenant near the same spring, with sacrificial worship ongoing the entire time. The olive press points toward the moment Zadok the priest retrieved the horn of anointing oil from David's tent at Gihon to crown Solomon king of Israel. The sacred vocabulary of this space, with altar and oil, standing stone, and sacred meal, runs continuously from the chambers Shukron excavated all the way through the temple Solomon built on the hill above it. The forms were ancient. They were shared with other Canaanite rituals. They were Canaanite in their origins and Yahwistic in their direction. And the hill that held them never stopped being sacred to the people that lived there. Back to Abraham. After that battle, he was walking home when he came to a valley below a city on a hill. The two kings came out to meet him in a place Genesis calls the Valley of Shava. Then Genesis pauses to explain it, calling it the King's Dale, as if the original audience who was reading Genesis needed the translation. That valley, sitting on the eastern edge of Jerusalem along the Kidron, is a place you may know already. It's the same valley John tells us Jesus crossed on the night of his arrest, moving through the darkness toward a garden on the other side where soldiers were already waiting. But long before that night, in the same valley, two very different offers were made to the same man. The first thing that meets him in that valley is not a throne room negotiation, it's a meal, bread and wine, carried out of the city by the king himself, not sent by a servant, not waiting inside the gate. Melchizedek came out, a king priest, the ruler of a city that Egypt had already marked as significant, walking down from his hill to meet a man coming home from battle and to serve him. In the ancient Near East, that act carried weight that's easy to miss from a modern distance. Kings didn't serve people. They received service. And the fact that Melchizedek came out himself, carrying food and drink, was an act of deliberate humility, a deliberate honor extended simultaneously, a recognition that what Abraham had just done deserves something more than political acknowledgement. And then there's the meal itself. In the ancient world, sharing bread and wine was not a casual gesture. It was a covenant act. These two specific elements were important. When two parties sat down and ate together, they were establishing something: relationship, mutual recognition, peace between them. And the shared meal was the oldest form of binding agreement the ancient world knew. Older than the written contracts, older than formal treaties, rooted in the simple human reality that you do not break bread with an enemy. Melchizedek wasn't just feeding a hungry warrior on his way home. He was receiving Abraham into a relationship, acknowledging him, honoring him, covering him with the blessing of the God Most High before the politics of the moment could assert themselves. This is the blessing that came with the bread. Elyon, possessor of heaven and earth, had delivered Abraham's enemies into his hand. That was the declaration Melchizedek made over the meal, and Abraham received it as exactly what it was. Not foreign religious language borrowed from an unfamiliar tradition, but the voice of his own God spoken through the mouth of a priest he had never met and would never see again. He gave Melchizedek a tenth of everything. In a world where the tithe was the ancient acknowledgement that the one receiving it was greater than the one giving it, Abraham was making a statement about who this man was and who the God he served was. He had just won a war that should have been unwinnable. He knew exactly who deserved the credit. Then the king of Sodom spoke. "Give me the people," he said. "Keep the goods for yourself." It was a reasonable offer within the context of the tribute economy that had started this entire conflict to begin with. The people of Sodom were his labor force, his tax base, his military conscripts, and without them, he was a king with a title and nothing else. The goods could be replaced, but the people were everything. His offer made perfect political sense, but Abraham refused him completely. He said, "I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet." That's in Genesis 14:22-23. Notice what Abraham does in that refusal. He swears by Yahweh El Elyon, explicitly equating the name Melchizedek had just used with the covenant name of his own God. He's not borrowing foreign religious language. He's saying out loud what he already knew. The God this priest serves and the God I serve are the same God, and having already given 10% of everything to that priest, he wasn't about to let the king of Sodom claim any credit for what God had done. The contrast between those two offers couldn't be any sharper. One king came with a political calculation dressed up as generosity. The other came with bread, wine, and a blessing, and he asked for nothing in return. Now think about the substance of that offering. Bread and wine, in the shadow of the same hill where centuries later, on the night before he was handed over to be crucified, the king priest who sat down with his disciples and took bread and wine said, "This is my body, which is given for you. And this cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for you." Same city, same elements of bread and wine, two king priests separated by almost 2,000 years. Is it any wonder that the writer of Hebrews points us to the connection between Melchizedek and Jesus of Nazareth? Then, when that meal and blessing were over, Melchizedek walked back through the gate of his city, and the ancient record closed behind him. No death record, no parentage, no children, no genealogy, no further mention for roughly 1,000 years. Now here's something the story of Melchizedek and Abraham doesn't tell us, but the rest of the Bible quietly fills in. Abraham didn't leave the world of Elyon worship behind when he walked away from that valley. He carried it to his family, not just through Isaac and Jacob in the line that would become Israel, but also through another line entirely. After Sarah died, Abraham took another wife named Keturah, and she bore him 6 sons. One of those sons was named Midian, and Midian's descendants became the Midianites, a people who would intersect with Israel's story at several critical moments. None more significant than the moment Moses fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian soldier and found himself sitting by a well in Midian, where he met the daughters of a man the text calls the priest of Midian. This little story is actually in my book. That priest's name was Jethro. He was a descendant of Abraham. He wasn't through the covenant line of Isaac and Jacob, though. He was through Keturah, through a branch of Abraham's family that had carried its own religious tradition forward into the wilderness of Midian, a tradition that the text never fully describes, but never dismisses either. Jethro was not a stranger to the God of Abraham through some vague cultural proximity. He was Abraham's grandson several times removed, and he was a priest. The text doesn't tell us exactly what Jethro's priesthood looked like before the moment everything changed for him, and we should be honest about that. Jethro wasn't a Levitical priest at all. He was in a different part of the family. What we do know is what happens when Moses comes back from Egypt, having just watched God dismantle the most powerful nation on earth, and then he drowned the army in the sea. Jethro heard all of it, and something in him recognized what he was hearing. He said in response, "Now I know that the Lord, Yahweh, is greater than all gods." Now I know, he said. Not, now I have heard of a new God. Not, now I am converting to a foreign religion. The language suggests a recognition rather than a discovery. a man who had been carrying a tradition of worship toward the highest God, finally hearing the name and the history that belonged to him. Jethro, in response, offered burnt offerings and sacrifices, and Aaron and all the elders of Israel sat down and ate bread with him before God, with no awkwardness, no correction, no suggestion that anything about this situation was inappropriate. This is the same pattern that the text established in Genesis 14. A non-Israelite priest, operating outside the covenant line, worshiping the God Most High through the forms his tradition knew, recognized as legitimate by the people of God without apology. Melchizedek did it with Abraham. Jethro did it with Moses and Aaron and the elders of Israel. And the question that the text here seems to invite, but never quite answers, is whether Jethro's declaration in that moment was the end of a long search, or the recognition of something his family had been carrying since Abraham sat down in the king's dale and broke bread with a priest of Elyon. From Melchizedek to Jethro, the Bible preserves something most people never slow down long enough to notice: a tradition of true worship running quietly outside the covenant line, carried by people who knew God by title before they knew him by name. Elyon, God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth, greater than all gods. They built altars above springs on hillsides. They pressed oil and offered sacrifice. They blessed the people of God and broke bread with them, and the text treats every bit of it as legitimate, without a word of apology or correction. The sacred name was not yet widely known, but God was known. He's never been without a witness. And then centuries after that, in the same city where Abraham knelt before a priest king in a valley, and he received bread and wine, God finally named the priest the whole tradition had been reaching toward. Not a Levitical priest with a verified genealogy and a tenure that ended at death. It was a priest after the order of Melchizedek, whose order predates the law, whose genealogy the text deliberately leaves blank, whose priesthood has no recorded end, who sat down at the right hand of the Father when the work was finished, because the work was actually indeed finished. His name is Jesus, and through him, everyone who has ever looked up and whispered Most High now has a name for the God and a name for the priest: Yahweh, Jesus. Years later, Abraham returned to this same hill with his only son, Isaac, to offer him as a sacrifice in obedience to the Most High. This time there was no priest, no mediator. Melchizedek didn't show up, because God himself provided the substitutionary sacrifice. Fast forward again a couple thousand years, and that hill saw another substitutionary sacrifice provided by God himself, the day the bread and the wine moved from symbol to reality. And that sacrifice in Jesus is offered for you today.